Good morning. Thank you all for coming. I think we should just do this the same way as everyone else. So we'll have the three papers in the order they are in the program, then the discussants' comments. I'll introduce each speaker before they speak, and then we'll open for discussion. So not really reinventing the wheel. So our first speaker is Dr. Patryk Wawrzyński from Nicolaus Copernicus University. And his paper is called, do you have a PowerPoint, by the way?
No, I don't.
No PowerPoint. Okay, great. His paper is called The Rainbow People of God, a South African lesson of Ubuntu hoping. How do you pronounce that? Hopping? Hoping.
Like hoping.
Okay. A South African lesson of Ubuntu hoping on relationships between religion and remembrance. And Patryk completed his doctoral degree in political science, and he specializes in social communication, especially on the impact of emotions on political narratives. Since March 2017, he's been employed at the Interdisciplinary Center for Modern Technologies at Nicolaus Copernicus University in Toruń, where he manages a study on the multi-level impact of emotions on remembrance and narratives. So we're looking very much forward to your paper. The floor is yours.
Okay, how much time I have?
20 minutes.
Okay. Thank you very much for the invitation and for being here quite early. And let me excuse for being that conservative and not having the PowerPoint presentation. I hope that still it might be interesting and informative presentation. I wish to, when I received the information about the call for papers of this conference, I was really trying to imagine how can I contribute to this great conference, and how can I involve my research on South African remembrance into the contents presented or offered by the organizers. And that was the moment when I decided to try to combine and compare two parts of the research that I'm doing. So a quite big research project that I was part of, which was focused on the role of remembrance narratives in identity reconstruction during the democratic transitions, and my current work on role of emotions in remembrance storytelling as a part of political communication. And that was the moment when I was thinking how to combine two data sets that I've collected. The first one was the presented, I did something wrong. Let me excuse for this. Yeah. Okay, that's great. So the part of the research that I will start with is presented mostly in this one of two volumes with my fellow colleagues, where I discuss the role of remembrance and how different aspects of remembrance and historical narratives were used in South Africa during the post-apartheid transformations to develop the new concept of inclusive and non-racial society. And in this context, it is worthy to mention that one of the core sources of this new concept of the society and the new inclusive identity was the idea of the rainbow nation that was highly influenced by the Christian vision of Ubuntu. And there was a great person of South African democratization, Archbishop Desmond Tutu, who was also the winner of Nobel Prize, awarded with the Peace Nobel Prize. And he was promoting the idea that the society, the new society after the apartheid, should be constructed on the basis of the opposition to all acts of violence and on the support of all kinds of reconciliation and forgiveness. So what I want to discuss today, and what I want to combine with different research that I was doing, so the research in which we organized some focus groups on the way how Polish youth is describing their emotional relationship with the Polish transformations and the role of solidarity in Polish transformation. So what I want to present is how differently religion played its role as a source of remembrance and also source of political narratives during South African transformations. And to start it, I need to draw a little of picture of the pre-transitional or transitional South Africa. So in 1993, so 1 year before the first democratic elections, South Africa was on the edge of the post-colonial nightmare and the bloodshed of very violent conflict between different racial and ethnic groups in the country. And that was the moment when Polish political refugee Janusz Waluś, inspired by African far-right nationalists, decided to murder one of the anti-apartheid leaders, the leader of South African Communist Party, Chris Martin Tembisile Hani. So on April 10th, 1993, South Africa was on the edge of the civil war. And the assassination of Chris Hani could be a sparkle that will fire the whole country. And a few days after this murder, during the funeral of Hani, Archbishop Tutu reminded his fellow citizens that we are marching to victory, the victory of goodness, of compassion over the cruelty of apartheid. We are marching to victory, the victory of peace and reconciliation over the violence and alienation of apartheid. We will be free. Dear friends, we commit ourselves, each one of us, we commit ourselves to discipline, we commit ourselves to peace, we commit ourselves to negotiation and reconciliation. For we are the rainbow people of God. We are moving to freedom and nobody can stop us. For God is on our side. So now you can see how deeply the Christianity was combined with the political side or social side of anti-apartheid struggle. So one of the core leaders of the anti-apartheid movement, Archbishop Tutu, he was claiming that the need for reconciliation and the need for forgiveness is not only based on political necessities of South African society. It's not just a political need of those times. It's also something which is good. And the major objective of transformation is something far more than political. It's not just democratization of the society. It's not just equal rights, and it's not just emancipation of the violated groups of the society. It's something which is based on the Christian morality and spirituality of Ubuntu. So the traditional spirituality, which is future-oriented and based on positive attitude towards the future, that what was claimed by Tutu, that the God was on their side. So that's the belief that the God is on the side of people who are doing the good things and they are and who are focusing on the good. So to understand what is the role of Ubuntu hoping and the Christian values in building new identity and in promoting forgiveness and reconciliation in South Africa, I also want to quote Desmond Tutu. In his later work, he emphasized that forgiveness and being reconciled are not about pretending that things are other than they are. It is not patting one another on the back and turning a blind eye to the wrong. True reconciliation exposes the awfulness, the abuse, the pain, the degradation, the truth. It could even sometimes make things worse. spurious reconciliation can bring only spurious healing. And years after the democratization in South Africa, Desmond Tutu, rethinking the path of forgiveness and reconciliation in South Africa, claimed that we all need forgiveness. There are times when all of us have been thoughtless or selfish or cruel. As we have said earlier, no act is unforgivable. No person is beyond redemption. When we are willing to let down our defenses and look honestly on our actions, we find there is a great freedom in asking for forgiveness and great strength in admitting the wrong. So, to present the role of religion in remembrance and reconciliation in South Africa, it is necessary to understand that there were 3 cores of it, and all these cores were transmitted as a superstructure of a new national identity. So firstly, it was a need of reconciliation. So the whole idea of Rainbow Nation, which was highly inspired by the biblical myth of Noah, and the hope that was connected with reconciliation, the building of new society, reconstructing a society from the deeply divided, based on racial prejudices, into inclusive community that is non-racial, that is open, and that is based on civic rights and rules of equality. That was the great idea that was deeply supported by the understanding how the Christian community should work in practice. Secondly, it was, of course, the forgiveness. So the forgiveness understood as not forgetting, but forgiving. So as a whole complex process that is supporting the role of remembrance and the role of collective memory in identity construction and political and social processes, but also based in understanding that people are making mistakes and everyone deserves to have a chance to work on rebuilding the community. And the third part, which was probably the most interesting part of the connection between the religion and transitional narratives in South Africa, was hoping. And hoping inspired by the Ubuntu Christianity. So the hoping that presented the whole process of transformation as something that will eventually end with good results. Because as there are good reasons for it, and people are trying to do their best, the one day's results will be something that is worth of struggling for it. So the positive attitude, which was far beyond political objectives and was presented in the longer perspective than 1 or 2 elections, was something that strengthened the community in South Africa. So to present it, of course, there were some transitional goals like building democratic representation in the parliament and building the democratic government, reconstruction of self-governance and making it more inclusive and representing more social groups and social interests inside. Of course, there were objectives like reconstruction of the army and the police and all security forces. So it's not like that there was no political and very practical aspects of the transformation, but there was something more in it. It was more like that we need a reconciliation, one day's reconciliation. Our children will be a reconciled society. And also there was some moral aspects in it. So South Africans were informed that maybe the whole transformation in this context of the religion and remembrance will never end, because it's never-ending story of being better and trying to be better and pursuing some moral goals. But it was inspiring people to try for the community. It's just not only like we are doing a roadmap and this roadmap is ending somewhere. It is something like we are trying to be better as citizens, better as individuals, but also better as a community and a society and the nation, which was the last part. So let me check my time. It's like a few minutes remaining. So the first aspect of it was to overcome the political violence. So during 4 years of transformations, so after Nelson Rolihlahla Mandela was released from the prison, till the first democratic elections took part in South Africa, there was more fatal victims than during the 40 years of the apartheid on both sides. And all policymakers and all transformation makers in South Africa had to understand that the first objective was to stop the violence and stop politically motivated killings. So that was also the reason why reconciliation and forgiveness and deeper motivations for reconciliation and forgiveness were that essential in this time. And to understand what kind of results were made from this kind of storytelling and identity reconstruction strategy, I want to refer to our comparative study of different aspects of different strategies of using politics of memory or remembrance policy in identity reconstruction during transformation. So if we come to the context of reconciliation, there are 4 major results of using reconciliation as a base in the core aspect of transitional narratives. So reconciliation, or using the reconciliation as a transitional objective, increases the importance of remembrance narratives as justification of symbolic roles of democratization and its intergenerational meaning. So reconciliation is making more, is resulting with more emphasis of politicians on the way how the history and our past should motivate us to become a democratic society. Secondly, it inspires governments to pay more attention to the promotion of national heroes as new role models. So the society is inspired by historical characters who are presented as some kind of representatives of core democratic or core civic values. Thirdly, it strengthens pro-democratic selection of narratives corresponding with necessities of political transformation. So what is told about the past is more a pro-democratic perspective. So there is more things that show how democracy should work and what are our democratic traditions and how we can recreate our traditions, even if they are not directly democratic, into something that will work in democracy and civic society. And fourthly, it promotes establishment of new definition of patriotism as a common framework for political and social standards promoted by the government. And also, when we take a look into a second component of this Ubuntu coping relationship to remembrance narratives in South Africa, there is also forgiveness. And forgiveness also plays 4 major roles, as we observed in our comparative study. It decreases the role of remembrance narratives as a justification for capitalism and the free market economy. In fact, the pursuit of forgiveness meant passing over economic transformations in silence. So there is less focus on economy, which is really different aspects of it, but there's less focus on economy during the transformations oriented to the forgiveness. So forgiveness is something which inspires the government not to talk about economy. Also, it reduces the significance of the past as the explanation of implementation of standards resulted as a result of international integration. So it's when we are focusing on forgiveness, it is less economic and less international. It's more oriented towards the society and more oriented toward internal process and internal reasons for transformation. Also, it promotes understanding of former elite presence in new political order as a way to prevent internal conflicts. So it's quite intuitive to understand like that. And also, like reconciliation, it strengthens a new definition of patriotism. So what we've noticed as a result of using the religious motivations and using the reconciliation and forgiveness as a principal goals of transformations is that governments tend to build new definition or new vision of patriotism that can be implemented using these two core values. And what is its impact, and what is this its relationship to the situation in Poland? What we observed during our focus groups, and when we ask our participants about their emotional relationship or the emotions that arise when they think about transformations and the role of solidarity, is that most of our participants, which were between 19 and 25 years old, expressed that even if they are agree that the anti-communist heritage in Poland is strong and important, even if they agree that it's kind of important for their identity, they expressed also that they believe that solidarity failed. And what they believe is that it was not able to deliver its promises. I'm not discussing if it's right, it's not. I'm just stating how they express it. And they were more sorrow than anger, because they knew, or they stated that they know that there was a lot of improvements, and it's better to live in today's Poland than it was for their parents. And of course they knew it, but so they were not angry with the situation, but they were sad because they believed that the Polish society or the Polish nation could be far better as a community than it's in practice. And what is in my opinion, a kind of a reason that in Poland we notice in the youth this kind of a dissatisfaction with the results of democratization and the heritage of solidarity? I believe that one of the reasons it was the lack of hoping, or the hoping that was oriented only towards a political goal. So after the European Union enlargement in Central Europe, most of Central European and Eastern European societies within the European Union experienced something like a lack of a great goal of transformation. So we were able to fulfill our transitional promises. So Poland and other countries are part of the Western world. They are included in the European Union and the NATO, so they are secure both of economic and political as well as military levels. But there is lack of community and there's lack of values. And that's maybe a question I really hope to end with my presentation, is to discuss if there was a possibility to use Christian values that were the core of anti-communist struggle, and that was one of the strongest inspirations for people to fight against the communist oppression. Was it possible to use Christian morality as kind of a long-term motivation for transformations, like it was presented by Desmond Tutu and Nelson Rolihlahla Mandela in South Africa? And if there was a perspective to explain the limited scope of decommunization policies and the limited scope of transitional justice in the perspective as it was described in South Africa. So as our choice to choose forgiveness over the vengeance. So I hope that we can return to these issues in discussion. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Patryk. With no further ado, then, our next speaker is Dr. Nadia Sanskar from the Ukrainian Catholic University in Lviv, where she is a postdoctoral researcher in the Department of Media and Journalism. Nadia completed her PhD in Applied Linguistics in 2016 with a project called The Lexical Field Crisis in inverted commas, in Ukrainian and English, graph-based and computational approaches. She also worked as a research fellow at the Open Society Archives, Central Eastern European University in Budapest, where she was researching Soviet propaganda techniques in the narratives on the revolutions during the Cold War period. And her paper today is called Religious Echoes of the Donbas Conflict, Contrast between the Rhetoric of Christian, Muslim, and Jewish communities in Ukraine.
Thank you very much. So first of all, I would like to thank you organizers for the great chance to be involved in this atmosphere of curiosity, research, inquiry, and building bridge between continents. So my study aims to define plurality of different narratives on Donbas conflict in Ukraine in terms of different religious denominations and the most dominant religions in Ukraine. So the religious media in Ukraine intensely highlight the conflict. And for me, as a linguist, the most interesting topics were which similar themes are brought up to develop the narrative, what lexical items were used, and do the religious organizations develop contradictory memories, which as a result may result in conflicting memories and contradictory vision of collective history and reality. So to answer these questions, I apply parallel corpus approach, Smith tools, and lexical semantic approach within the domain of lexical, structural, linguistic, and lexical semantics. So my first hypothesis was that the conflict in Donbas promoted the transition of religious discourse into the domain of political and public discourses. And the religious narratives of Donbas conflict, mainly developed by religious leaders, crossed the boundaries, traditional autonomous boundaries of religious communities, and they became the integral part of public discourse in Ukraine. The second hypothesis was that the religious organizations used different rhetoric strategies to produce image on the same themes of the narratives and promote divergent interpretations of the conflict. So, first of all, I would like to give a broad context on my research. So first of all, Donbas conflict became a catalyst for different transformations in our society, and they are revealed at different levels. So first of all, there are changes in religious self-identification of Ukrainians. Probably you know that Ukrainians position themselves, 67% of Ukrainians position themselves as Orthodox Christians. However, the conflict deepened the confrontation between two rival Orthodox churches in Ukraine, Kiev and Moscow Patriarchate. And the number of believers has increased in Kiev's Patriarchate and decreased in the Moscow Patriarchate. Also, this year, as you know, has become a historical moment in the history of Ukrainian Orthodox Church, and it is involved in the process of granting autocephaly. And also it became a political re-election, as it is called in media of Ukraine, re-election priority of Poroshenko, along with building up strong army and developing Ukrainian language. And this billboard said that we are Ukraine, army defends our land, language defends our hearts, and faith defends our souls. So this focus on faith is a very dominant feature in the public discourse of Ukrainian political discourse. So religious holidays and state holidays also tend to be blending. So, and the process of decommunization promoted the legislation on new holidays. And in 2015, a new holiday was introduced. It is Defendants Ukraine Day, and it is celebrated on the 14th of October. And this day is especially important for Christians, Orthodox Christians and Greek Catholic Church, Christians of Ukraine, because this day is the day of protection of Holy Virgin. And this holiday dates back to the 17th century when Virgin Mary was a patroness for Cossacks. And they prayed her before they went to defend Ukraine, before they fighting. Another holiday is also Dignity and Freedom Day, and it is a symbolical coincidence because this day is to remark, to honor the revolutions we had in Orange Revolution in 2004 and previous Euromaidan. And this day is also encourage the Orthodox idea of symbolic struggle of the Ukrainians with the regime of Yanukovych when the human rights were violated. And in this picture you can see Michael, Archangel Michael, who is a symbolic representation of the God's warrior of his army against the evil. So, Invisible Army of Chaplains. This year, on Independence Day, was the first time in the history of independent Ukraine when chaplains were participating in the military parade of Ukraine. And the Institute of the Chaplaincy was introduced as a structural unit of the National Guard of Ukraine, and it also promoted some changes in the army. Another change is national unity in the collective prayers. So prayers also crossed the boundaries of religious denominations, and they became public events. For example, Maidan is the first point when it started when all religious representatives could pray together, where the boundaries of denominations melted and the spiritual power and belief in God was the uniting force. And also, as well in this year, there was a synchronous world prayer, which aimed to unite all Ukrainians all over the world in their prayer, in their trust in God and hope for better life in Ukraine. So, and another moment is charity religious organizations. So religious organizations are participating in charity, in humanitarian aid, and they do not focus on special religious groups. They help just is despite of religious belonging. So as for methodology, I used corpus-based and lexical-semantic approaches, and I tried to approach structurally to the narratives, and I focused on such elements of the narratives as situations. So the way they refer, religious narratives refer to the situation, place, actors. Under actors, I mean Ukrainian army and the confronting side. Then how do religious communities appeal to the role of society in the conflict, the role of power in the authorities in the conflict, and what are the ways to resolve this conflict. So, first of all, the two churches which are the most popular in Ukraine are Moscow and Kyiv Patriarchate, and the narratives show the meta-narrative of the discourse is confrontation. So, it is the main theme represented, and it is a vivid feature of both narratives. So, and semantic analysis show that history monopolizing, distortion of orthodox canons, victimization, positive self-presentation, power polarization, and negative presentation is it's a mistake, is more common for Moscow Patriarchy. What I mean, history monopolizing, the narratives immensely use history, and they stress on Slavic unity of Russians and Ukrainians to promote this history on the future, to give the vision of common future based on their common past. So as well, person of Volodymyr the Great is a favorite personality in their discourse, and they try to make a parallel between peacemaking, as they declared, mission of Moscow Patriarchate, and peacemaking role of Prince Volodymyr in the history. So they try to make the same parallel and to frame it in this way. Then, a distortion of Orthodox canons. As for the main canons of Orthodox Church, righteous war is justified when there is a right need, just clear need for defense against aggression. But the Moscow Patriarchate rhetoric ignores it, and they try to focus on participation as the sin, as a mortal sin of killing, and they describe it as fratricidal war. So they try to show participation as fratricidal murder, and it allows to promote the message of reconciliation and humility and obedience. And one of the priests has mentioned that the sin of fratricidal murder may deprive people of salvation. And the church, meaning Moscow Patriarchate, fulfills its patriotic duty by saving its children from the fall. Victimization is also a dominant feature in the rhetoric, and they're trying to focus on civilians who are affected by the conflict. They use emotional language like blood, tears. They mention children affected by conflict, orphans, mothers, widows. Positive self-presentation reveals in different domains. First of all, one of them is Union of Orthodox Journalists. It's a specific platform, media platform, where journalists, and they position themselves as Orthodox, first of all, journalists, they use this platform for creating an image, for improving the image of Moscow Patriarch in Ukraine, and their themes range from interpreting the war in Donbas as civil conflict to severe critics of other Christian denominations in Ukraine, as well critics of authorities of Ukraine, and so on. Also, this self-presentation, positive self-presentation rhetoric is expressed in film production, and since 2002, there is a film Pokrov, International Orthodox Film Festival in Ukraine. And what is interesting that 2 years ago, they awarded a prize for the film of Georgi Davidov, After the War, as a best prize, as a best film, short film. And this film also is very coherent with the main narratives of the Moscow Patriarchate. It shows useless of the war, guilt of Ukrainian authorities for the war and for the destruction of Donbas, innocent victims, betrayal of motherland, and need for reconciliation. The narratives try to oppose power. Power polarization is an evident feature, and they show the Ukrainian authorities as solely responsible for the conflict. And it also approached as a reason of Maidan, which was the clash of cultural differences, cultural values, European values, and Orthodox Christian values of the people of Donbas. And the negative presentation of Kyiv Patriarchy. So they do not recognize the Orthodox status of Kyiv Patriarchate, and it's the main feature. They try to blame them and to show that they are not true Orthodox. So as for Orthodox Kyiv Patriarchate, so they treat conflict as aggression of Russia, first of all. They declare that it's aggression of Russia and it's a war. And they try to show Ukraine as a peaceful country which couldn't avoid this conflict because it gave its nuclear power. And the Budapest Memorandum was violated. And in this respect, they tried to show the global dimension of this conflict as the violation of international law and the challenge to world order in general. Moscow Patriarchy, on the contrary, the reason is viewed as the clash of values, hostile European values, and Ukrainization, and maybe Western, as well, history of Western Ukraine, which is imposed on the people of East Ukraine, and they try to underline this opposition between West and East of Ukraine. So, and interesting phrase from Kirill, Episcopal Council, which says that internecine war has broken out in the eastern areas of the historical Rus. So it's a basic statement which is used by Moscow Patriarchy, and because they are in jurisdiction of Russian Orthodox Church. So, as well, the main narrative of Kyiv Patriarchate is with their narrative. They try to oppose different things like power, previous power of Ukraine and current power of Ukraine, Soviet past and European future. Then oppose as well themselves with the Moscow Patriarchate. And evident feature of their discourse is victory. They are promoting the belief in victory. And victory becomes also not only a public appeal, but a religious ceremony, and it is expressed in special prayer for victory. And not only for victory, but it sounds like prayer for the victory of aggressor and establishment of the righteous peace in Ukraine. And this prayer extends the ordinary boundaries of religious denomination, and it became a public event which united officials, citizens of different states. And in 2017, there was a national prayer for Ukraine and prayer for the victory. Kyiv Patriarchy and Moscow Patriarchy have different attitude to heroes, to actors involved in the conflict. So first of all, in 2014, Orthodox Kyiv Patriarchy introduced a medal for participation for defense of Ukraine and for serving to Ukraine. And Filaret awarded this medal to people who were involved in Euromaidan and to people who protect, who defend Donbas, and who have just posthumously as well. So, and this award has been given to 14,000 of people, even for 1 year. So it was introduced in 15th, and in 16th they have given 14,000 of medals. As for Moscow Patriarchy, they try to avoid labeling any side into heroes, into enemies. And you can see a photo taken from commemoration when President Poroshenko awarded posthumously Hero of Ukraine title, and all representatives of religious denomination, they stood up, and representatives of Moscow Patriarchy didn't stand up because it was their protest against the war, as they explained later. So, resolution of the conflict. They have different vision of the conflict, so they approach resolution as well differently. First of all, Kyiv Patriarchy calls for international attention and awareness of global danger. Besides, the very dominant feature is appeal for Ukrainians to unite around the mutual belief in Ukraine. Moscow Patriarchy, in the contracts, they appeal to flexibility of the Ukrainian authorities and ending the fratricidal war. So they also mention about forgiveness, reconciliation, humility, and obedience. And a very interesting quotation also by Kirill is that the brotherhood of the Russian, Ukrainian, and Belarus people is a reality, achieved through the suffering of many of our ancestors' generations. This reality, dwelling in our hearts, must define our future and may not be sacrificed for the sake of instantaneous interests. And this phrase, instantaneous interest, is impressive in this context. So, although the Moscow Patriarchy presents themselves as peacemaking position, they were criticized in our media as betraying separatist church. First of all, the reasons for it, that there are contacts with Kremlin authorities, and in 2013, Putin awarded medal for friendship, for promoting friendship to Onufriy, the Metropolitan of Moscow Patriarchy. Then the priests who stay in occupied territories are criticized for their support of the terrorists and pro-Russian warriors. And in this picture you can see blessing of Girkin, who is accused as well of shooting down the Malaysia Airlines, and who was the first leaders in Donbas in 2014. And another moment that describes the still political position of Moscow Patriarchy is the religious processions one day before the Crimean annexation. They had the processions which started in Sevastopol as the key moment and the symbolical place where Vladimir the Great was baptized, and they ended in Moscow. And what is important in this process, that they used the icon of Virgin Mary's estate, Державная. And this icon is referred as the patroness of Russia, of its statehood and stability. So, Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, the main features are sacralization of Euromaidan. They denote Maidan as a place where moral revolution started in Ukraine, and it still goes on. Then they glorify heroes, and they underline the self-sacrifice of heroes is the highest virtue of Christian love to the country and to love as in general Christian meaning. They also try to glorify nation and their society focusing. So first of all, they appeal to society to build good country within the social relations, to be morally clear, and then to win the aggressor. So enemy targeting is expressed in two sides. First of all, it's Russia, and secondly, it's inner enemy, it's corruption. Also, very interesting that they present Russians as victims of Kremlin propaganda, and they do not oppose Russians as a people as enemies. So they try to distance from the authorities, and also they blame them for corruptions, and they try to focus on people, and as a church that always stayed with people under any circumstances. Victimization is the rhetoric focused on heavenly heaven, people who died at Maidan, and victims of people who sacrificed their lives for the sake of Ukraine in Donbas. Also, Catholic Church has liturgies when they mention power, enemies. They have prayers for enemies, for power, for authorities, for victims. So, although Islam, I'm closing to Islam, just trying to be. Islam has a long tradition in Ukraine. It's a sad story, but we have heard about Islam more closely only after annexation of Crimea and conflict in Donbas. And besides, this conflict also promoted some transformation within the ethnic community of Crimean Tatar. And it is expressed in the Charter of Muslims of Ukraine and Social Concept of the Muslims of Ukraine. These are the main documents which were introduced after the conflict. And now also we are observing Islam Renaissance in Ukraine, when a lot of different cultural centers are opened in the biggest cities of Ukraine, which promote Islam vision, and they keep the bridge between Crimea and Ukraine. And they give the voice, they present the voice of Crimea, which is unheard now in Ukraine. So, and you can see that they are also focusing on society. They are trying to find their place in Ukraine. And the most interesting rhetoric is sacralization of Crimea and Ukraine. Ukraine and Crimea are presented as something sacred, as a home, as the only home for Tatars to have. And this sacralization is also expressed in even official documents, because they have very strict position on defense of Ukraine as a civil and moral duty of Muslims in Ukraine. Also, they have hero glorification, just I will mention it a little bit earlier. Russia is presented as a common enemy of Ukrainians and Tatars, so they are uniting and they are incorporating in Ukrainian society in this. Positive self-presentation. According to the survey, 18% of Ukrainians have negative attitudes to Islam as a religion. And due to development of different cultural projects, different educational startups, they try to present positively Islam in Ukraine. And the resolution in conflict they see as complete deoccupation of Ukraine. And in this moment, they touch upon the topic of betrayal of Ukraine. And they show the parallel with the Crimea, when the Ukrainian authorities couldn't do everything they could to protect and to avoid the occupation. And they just try to show that this time you have to do everything possible to deoccupy Donbas, because you have commitment, moral commitment to all those people who have died and who are still in the occupied regions. So, and very interesting representation and stereotype-breaking representation of heroes. First of all, they give focus on female warriors. And Iryna Grigorieva is a character, a warrior who represents and who breaks the stereotype of a traditional view of a Muslim woman. She was a charismatic leader, she was politically active, and she was devoted to Islam. Another feature which also shows involvement of Crimean Tatar in the conflict is a film, and it was produced by Akhtem Saytavlayev, who is originally from Crimea. And also his phrase was that with this film, he tried to show that it is not a civil war, but it is the chance to make a shift from one civilization to the other. And the last organization I researched was Jewish organization, and the most important rhetoric strategies were victimization. So they focus on victims, and particular Jewish victims who suffered in Ukraine, and this topic touches upon repatriation, then just help to refugees from those regions, and so on. Then they give very interesting parallel with Ukraine and Israel's state. So they trying to show that Ukraine, as Israel, has very strong leaders around, strong countries, and they have to struggle to save their statehood. And Israel is also presented as a military guru, as a professionally with professional army and so on. And they try to show it in a positive rhetoric that Ukraine has to look upon Israel and to develop the army to become able to protect itself. And enemy targeting, also they focusing on Russia as an enemy, but they are not so stressing on Russia, and they just more generalize the enemy as a concept. So the main conclusions: war of Russia is treated mostly as a conflict, is treated mostly as a war of Russia against Ukraine, and also all denominations underline the historical transition from the Soviet Union to Europe. Then the most common rhetoric strategies are rhetoric on enemy and victim. Hero glorification unites religiously divergent organizations, and the concept of a defender is very important, that Ukraine is not presented as a victim, but they try to present Ukraine as a defender of its territory and a fighter for justice. And all Christian churches emphasize on reconciliation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nadia. That was a wonderful comparative analysis. Our last paper is a theoretical paper, and the speaker is Tomasz Wiśniewski from Adam Mickiewicz University in Poznań, where Tomasz is doing a PhD thesis about post-secular history, and he's interested in the theory of history, political philosophy, post-humanities, and the post-secular turn. And his paper is titled Post-Secular Struggles for Epistemic Justice.
Yes, thank you very much for organization of the conference and accepting my paper. It's a big pleasure to be here and hear all these presentations. Contrary to the most of previous presentations, mine is of mostly theoretical, not empirical nature. And the aim of my paper is to examine theoretical positions that might be gathered under an umbrella of the term epistemic justice in the context of so-called post-secular turn. By the post-secular turn, I understand here a return of religion and other spiritual theological positions into the realm of humanities and social sciences. In its polemical dimension, post-secular term contests secularism as a foundation of Western academic knowledge. Thus, apparently methodological controversy reveals its political stakes. This is not a coincidence that some post-secular scholars are also engaged in post-colonial studies, such as Ananda Beysekara, Talal Asad, and Dipesh Chakrabarty, to mention only a few. In my paper, I will focus on Ananda Beysekara's ideas presented in his book, The Politics of Post-Secular Religion, Mourning Secular Futures, from year 2008. I consider his ideas of mourning secular futures and uninheriting, understood as a method of mourning secular futures, as manifestations and strategies of realizing epistemic justice. Beysekara, a scholar from Sri Lanka who works in the United States, describes the mergers made by Western science and imported political culture in a non-European world. He makes a familiar argument that its allegedly neutral and objective categories are in fact deeply ethnocentric. Subsequently, when Western science and politics start to translate, interpret, and reshape contexts external to them, they lead to forfeiture and loss of very content of these contexts. Usually, they do it in some violent way. Although after centuries of such epistemic violence, Western academia tries to work through its past and to explain its faults, it often produces representations that are irrelevant and still make harms. Western secularism in its various forms is an ethnocentric and violent ideology. Beysekara tries to find conceptual solutions for this problem. He proposes a notion of uninheriting, which is inspired by a Nietzschean idea of active forgetting of the past. His motivation is clearly ethical. For Beysekara, problems with past history are issues of present memory and consciousness and could be healed by some brave interventions in the domain of contemporaneity. I would like to start my remarks with a short reflection of the notion of epistemic justice and located in the post-secular context. The concept belongs to so-called analytic social epistemology and has been recently elaborated by Miranda Fricker and other scholars, often with reference to its negative counterpart, an epistemic injustice. In her book Epistemic Injustice, Power and the Ethics of Knowing, from 2007, Fricker differentiates between two distinctive forms of injustice, testimonial and hermeneutical. There we see a quotation from her book. Inspired by specific discourse of analytical philosophy, Fricker proposes a highly abstract and model-like types of injustice which would be difficult to find in the real world in their clear forms. I would propose to consider testimonial and hermeneutical injustice not as different kinds, but rather as two moments in a continuum of epistemic injustice that might be grasped in concrete circumstances. In such case, a kind of causal dependency might appear between them. Testimonial injustice, as freaker rights caused by prejudice in the economy of credibility, should be perceived as a result of hermeneutical injustice, which creates, as freaker rights, structural prejudices in the economy of collective hermeneutical resources. Postcolonial, postsecular contexts examined by Abey Sekarra, Assad, or Chakrabarty are highly complex assemblages of heterogenic, unequal, and non-contemporaneous factors. They stand as hermeneutical resources established and distributed in the act of secular colonial appropriation. In short, epistemic injustice cannot appear without epistemic violence that forms its structural systematic background. In turn, Steve Fuller stresses that epistemic justice concerns the optimal distribution of knowledge and power in society. He mentions two main strategies of interpreting the problem. Fuller writes, one supposes that more knowledge helps concentrate power, the other that it helps distribute power. In such account, knowledge can be understood as a plastic resource used in political struggles by various actors. As Fuller admits, knowledge involves both the expansion and contraction of possibilities for action. There is also another important feature of epistemic justice. Its power, potential, operative abilities must be situated in some horizon, referred to some external point. As Fuller writes, we see, knowledge expands the knower's own possibilities for action by contracting the possible actions of others. These others may range from fellow knowers to non-knowing natural and artificial entities, insofar as they are capable of impeding the knower's will. Moreover, the others may even be one's own future states, in which case knowledge is power refers to an agent's sphere of autonomy. Knowledge for which one aspires lies in kind of tight contact between us and them, but this relationship is not antagonistic necessarily. In fact, these others can be of very various character. They could be very close to one's position, they could be one's somewhat external allies or friends, one's internal or external enemies or foes. I am sure these others could have a form of institutions, social habits, traditions, political actors, and even supernatural entities such as gods, demons, ghosts of ancestors, places, and natural organisms, both in direct, mundane, and imaginative forms. In the most direct way, an epistemic justice is a compensation for previous epistemic violence. The processes of establishing Western cognitive empire and colonizing non-Western types of knowledge has been critically recognized. In its most extreme forms, scholars are talking about epistemicide, killing indigenous knowledges, as says Bonaventura de Sousa Santos. In turn, the British anthropologist Jack Goody analyzed epistemic violence as manifested in the process that he called a theft of history. In his view, Western science for several centuries have been appropriating and erasing achievements of other civilizations, hiding knowledge about it, and imposing vision of history in which all significant discoveries have been made by Westerners, with other peoples playing only a role of objects of Western scientific activity. Western culture and society has been established as a normative pattern for evolution of humanity. Indigenous patterns of social life, ways of knowing, technological solutions, and so on, has been covered and ousted by the Western ones. These motives of critique are well known and in the process of rediscovery of significance and potential of indigenous knowledges are slowly progressing. Secular Western knowledge aims to inscribe data on local context into allegedly objective, transcendence-based framework. Such framework and its criteria draw on historically conditioned assumptions which represent particular power knowledge configurations of Western mind established in its past. For example, scholarly understanding of religion, as indicated by Tomoko Masuzawa, Talal Asad, or Jill Anijar, is in fact a Western invention which hardly applies to cultural contexts different from European. It breaks and divides a given holistic context into supposedly ontologically separate domains, such as politics, science, religion, spiritual and/or material culture, and so on. For example, as Bruno Latour argues in We Have Never Been Modern, Western phantasm of modernity, which Latour calls the modern constitution, is based on a fundamental distinction between objective, scientifically cognizable nature and subjective, socially construed cultures. It is reproduced in multiple ways. Its archetypical figures are only ideological projections, fetishes, which in fact conceal more, I mean knowledge about reality shaping processes, than they reliably communicate. For Latour, the most credible and insightful perspective is provided by anthropologists because it intends to describe whole social worlds, consisting of not peoples only, but also of things, animals, places, rivers, mountains, ghosts, gods, and so on, as well as mutual relationships and dependencies between them. They conceptualize whole complex ontologies and/or cosmologies. Then it is not surprising that nowadays many anthropologists and archaeologists, such as, for example, Severin Falls in his book An Archaeology of Doings, Secularism and the Study of Pueblo Religion, treats Latour's reflections as their theoretical inspiration. One can qualify such tendency as compensation movements within Western academia, which effort to reward indigenous groups for past epistemic harms. This process is a manifestation of a struggle for epistemic justice. In such context, one might consider epistemic justice as a kind of restorative and non-material reparative justice. Considering described above positions and their inherent ethical stake, I would propose to reflect on the idea of epistemic justice and follow a question posited by Thomas Stearns Eliot in his poem Gerontion. After such knowledge, what forgiveness? There is a fragment of Eliot's poem with this phrase. I use the notion of epistemic justice as an affirmative antonym to epistemic violence introduced by Gayatri Chakravorty Spivak. Abhay Sekara doesn't write about epistemic justice literally, but he uses the notion of epistemic violence. For example, Abhay Sekara writes about epistemic violence of capitalism, whose power today is more anonymous yet systematic than ever. And further, the modern economy, haunted by the former state policies, is engaged in perpetrating epistemic violence against its minorities by obliging them to endorse a national practice of political moral import. Although these enunciations can sound enigmatically, they indicate a phenomenon of epistemic violence as being something hidden and invisible, cunningly inscribed into mechanism and even nature of major processes, like flows of global capital. Thus, epistemic violence is related to an ethical approach to reality and can be grasped in analysis of its local manifestations that reflect a broader system of structural epistemic violence. Therefore, solutions to this problem might be the most effective when developed on the local level. Various redemptive strategies can be successfully defined in the frame of struggles for epistemic justice. Abhay Sekara's reflection rotate around some ideas of such actions. Although Abhay Sekara remarks on epistemic violence are not explicit, I see his conceptual innovations and especially his idea of uninheriting as a possibility to approach the problem in an interesting way. Now we see a quote, I think this is one of core quotations from Abhay Sekara book. As we can read, the act of epistemic justice can be done not in a way of choosing one option versus another one, like oblivion versus memory, but a very assumption of premises lying behind framework which imposes such choice should be contested. Such move of contestation or abolition or deactivation is inevitably twofold. Abhay Sekara later indicates the obvious, as he writes, the obvious problems of the heritage of the state and its laws that redefine the boundary between religion and the secular. He claims that when the distinction between religion and the secular appears as a problem, this is a Nietzschean genealogical critique which entitles us to think about mourning or uninheriting that history instead of just seeing it in terms of its ambiguities. For this scholar, this distinction hides an inherently political stake. This stake is governed by interests of modern national state, and as such, the distinction is an instrument of its hegemony. Now we see the later enunciation of Abbé Secara. He comes to a point in which he states that historical pasts are only a fragment of a broader porous continuum. Active forgetting of history means to end the repression of these subaltern pasts, as they are called by Dipesh Chakrabarty, and to establish a more intimate contact with them. This is secular futures, what is dead and subsequently mourned. Contrary, pasts return to the world of the living. And the next quotation from Abbé Secara. In my opinion, such positions create objections and even dangers. It is suspicious when one talks about the ghosts of the past in the context of non-juridical futures. Modern secular scholarship assigns these ghosts to close domain of the past and closes them there. But when we get rid of academic judging and the repressed pasts reveal out as our contemporaries, then the ghosts will be freed, like in the case of mythical Pandora's box. The release of specters can demolish institutionalized knowledge. In fact, this is what it might be currently observed in Eastern Central Europe, where memory politics is turning specters into demons of the past. These specters or demons are vehicles and instruments of power, especially for those who want to legitimize their power or they only strive for it, for power. No need to say that what for one group might be considered as good spirits of emancipatory power, for another ones are demons of oppressive regime. What has been an obscure odd spook in the past later can be established as a sacred myth and a source of ontological security and new order. The Foucaultian idea of a spiral of power and resistance seems to work well here. Such dangers, I think, has been recognized by psychoanalysis a long time ago. Here we are seeing Sigmund Freud observations from his classical essay Civilization and its Discontents. Psychoanalytic theory calls such occurrences regressive processes and consider them to be defense mechanisms. Postsecular criticism can help to work through and unravel some relatively recent layers of conflicts, but it also can uncover some deeply hidden traumas, figures, or lines of confrontations and make them agentive again. Then such hitherto insignificant, or only supposed to be insignificant because hidden and unknown, element can unexpectedly become a decisive factor shaping new current political antagonism. Such retroactively structured subject experiences something that psychoanalysts call splitting, a division and falling apart of the world into two ontologically separate and mutually hostile domains. Eventual engagement in epistemic justice should be aware of such possible peril, an entanglement in next configuration of conflict. I think Abbé Secara is aware of such possibility, and this is why he tries to neutralize it in advance with concept of uninheriting, which is strictly linked with mourning secular futures. He simply arises not only some confusing and painful pasts, but also possible horizons of future conflicts. Epistemic justice cannot take a responsibility for a shape of the future and its political coordinates. Its role is clearly more modest. Because one present is full of past specters, one cannot let in future specters, and some decreasing of the field of struggle is necessary. Binaries present not only a kind of disjunctive horizontal opposition, but 2 points, the starting and the ending ones, of some evolutionary processes. Such points are imaginary, at least. One can call them ideal types in meaning of Max Weber too. The process can be understood as a disenchantment, rationalization, or a linear accumulation of knowledge. Uninheriting, then, equates to leaving this succession and erasing of original binary division, dismantling particular organization of knowledge, and subsequently giving a freedom to its hitherto components. Such solution corresponds with questions of democracy raised by Abbé Secara. Modern secular democracy is of paradoxical nature in two ways. It consists both dimension of linear process of purification of some irrational substance by progress in knowledge and political procedures, for instance, as well as a horizontal exclusion of politically incorrect elements hostile to it. One must cancel living in a state of deferral by dilating its fundamental teleological assumption. And then, as one can hope, a horizontal antagonism would disappear too. It is worthy to mention at this point that such scenario has been sketched by French writer Michel Houellebecq in his famous novel Submission about the Islamization of the French Republic, and many commentators are afraid that his vision is in fact a dystopia. Yes, following Friedrich Nietzsche's meditations on history, one can say that surplus of knowledge is harmful to life when it concerns the knowledge's holistic organization structure, which always realized and communicated, reproduced, taught, and so on in an oppressive, violent way. Then, Abel-Sekara's active forgetting might erase some framework of knowledge, but not its matter, its content. There remains this material demanding new form in order to transform into new content. Epistemic unburdening of actors, be they human and or non-human actors, follows such way. But there is a danger that such erasing will lead to exposition of some archaic paradigms, organizations of knowledge previously covered by new layers. Similar phenomenon has been subject of reflections of philosopher Claude Lefort in The Permanence of the Theologico-Political, or a theorist of history Frank Ankersmit too, who in neoliberal governance sees a contemporaneity of Middle Ages, covered only by a thin layer of modern institutions. And Ankersmit follows here Reinhard Koselleck, who considers this contemporaneity of Middle Ages as an example of chronological insubordination, the notion by Koselleck. Such epistemic shifts and their possible politically reactionary consequences are a constant risk of postsecularity. I paid attention to that by quoting Freud's observation. We don't know what will follow after attempts to deactivate fundamental distinctions of secular organization of knowledge. We must stay prepared for a move which Max Weber has called the sacrifice of the intellect. And thus, to sum up, an epistemic justice is a scarce good. Doing epistemic justice is an activity of local and limited character, usually. It is redemption of some previous harms done by epistemic violence. But when epistemic justice confronts with holistic organizations of knowledge, its foreground positive aspects can contribute to hide or to make invisible some new potential evil emerged from epistemic chaos and anarchy. We haven't discovered an effective way of distribution of epistemic justice yet. A vision of peaceful coexistence of various specters is, I think, naive. Such risk applies to post-secular term as a whole, both positions inscribed in traditions of Judeo-Christian monotheism. Usually they draw on concealed and sublimed apocalyptic resentment, as German philosopher Peter Sloterdijk shows it in his book Rage and Time, or German Egyptologist and archaeologist Jan Assmann traces it in his numerous books, for instance, The Mosaic Distinction or The Price of Monotheism. Not only Judeo-Christian monotheism, but to the more pagan possible competitors. Some direction there can be put on discussed by archaeologists and anthropologists, such as, for example, Eduardo Viveros de Castro, ideas of multinaturalism and or ontological pluralism. At the end, I think I might ask again, after Thomas Stearns Eliot, after such knowledge, what forgiveness? Thank you for the attention.
Thank you, Tomasz. That was a thought-provoking and very inspiring paper. Now, Dr. Oksana Myshlovska will try to compare and draw some some lines between these very diverse and interesting papers. Oksana is a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Bern, where she's been since July this year. She's now working on a project that focuses on the role of civil society in conflict transformation and reconciliation in relation to history memory in Ukraine. He's also worked at Sussex University and the Swiss Development Agency, where she contributed to a learning journey on governance in fragile and conflict-affected contexts. And before that, she worked at the University of St. Gallen and the Global Studies Institute in Geneva. And one of her recent publications is a co-edited volume called Regions Without Regionalism, Rethinking Ukraine's Heterogeneity, which came out with Central Eastern European University Press. Central European University Press.
Thank you very much for this introduction. First of all, I would like to thank our three presenters, and I think we had two of the papers which were given are really a continuation of what we discussed yesterday, and I really found a lot in common, in especially what Julian and Ioannis presented yesterday in terms of what role religion can play in post-conflict reconciliation, but also during conflict. And I found that we, as both Julian and Ioannis provided us examples where in the case of Bosnia it can be both positive and negative, and here we also have in the first two papers very similar kind of considerations which we can use, where Patryk presented us with a vision how religion can play a role in building this common ground and in reconciliation and post-authoritarian transition to democracy, and kind of a new ground for building a rainbow nation which goes like interracial interdependence, using this concept of interracial interdependence, but also the hope and this direction into the future. For Nadia, it was also the role of religion plays currently in the current conflict in Ukraine, and also she showed very well the public engagement of different religious denominations and how various religious denominations, how they take positions and comment on the most important issues pertaining to the conflict. And Nadia showed us different categories which she used to analyze on the use kind of on the discourse analysis which she has carried out, and she shows how this most dividing issues, the nature of the conflict, the nature, who are the parties involved in the conflict, how dividing is kind of how the churches define and differently interpret this kind of the most dividing issues in the conflict. Also, Nadia showed us how much religion and national identity, how much they are linked in such discourse. And in the introduction to her paper, Nadia mentions that she would also like to analyze how this, the discourse of different religious denomination, how it also translates into kind of impact on identity building at the kind of country level. And I think it can be a very productive way to further develop the country, because if you look at various surveys, that there is really correspondence between the discourses which are promoted by various religious denominations and also the discourses which are shared, the understanding of the conflict and all of the dividing lines which were presented by Nadia, we also see reflected in terms of identity beliefs of Ukrainian population. Then going into separate papers, I really enjoyed very much Patryk's paper and analyzing the role of religion, because as you correctly say, this transitional justice literature would be missing on such important part of kind of this vision and thinking on the basis which unites as a future for reconciliation. Although I a bit found that overly optimistic, because as we know, there is a lot of literature which is discussing current problems with the current vision of Rainbow Nation, and with a variety of criticism about corruption, about limited nature of reconciliation, and about kind of even the criminal and transitional justice as the whites kind of escaping and paying very small price for the whole. And this discourse, it just shows how important that this discourse of reconciliation, it has to be fed and all the time, where it can derail and can be challenged from different sides. Also, I found very interesting his comparison, this big picture comparison between Eastern Europe and different transition in South Africa. I think there is a lot of potential. Now we have very important kind of conceptualizing big picture publications in transitional justice by Eva Clarita Petai, Lavinia Stein, and all of these kind of this transitional justice, where like the last book I saw that's a kind of a mapping of all thinking about this internal transition and about how different groups negotiated in different ways this future vision of the nation and future vision of reconciliation. And they, in the last books I read, they ask exactly this question, that the next step would be to compare Eastern European transition to in larger frameworks, and you're already starting in this kind of thinking that I think there is a lot of potential there. Here, I would like to mention that if we look internally as a kind of as Polish internal negotiation, there is kind of maybe the absence of this reconciliation rhetoric. But if we look beyond Poland as internal community, for example, at Ukrainian-Polish reconciliation, there Christian common language has been fundamental, and both the Roman Catholic Church and the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church and Roman Catholic Church in Ukraine, they have played fundamental role in using this exactly hope and Christian discourse for reconciliation. So I think we should not only focus on internal kind of reconciliation discourses, but also see that religion is used in external reconciliation efforts. Then what I found could be also interesting is to have this productive comparative framework. It's to go deeper into contextualization of and looking at factors which you can use to compare the South African and Eastern European kind of examples of transition and building sense of community. We think it could be interesting to look at European colonialism versus like this concept of Russian imperialism, colonialism as a larger comparative frameworks, and also looking at kind of the way that Europe has already worked through its colonial past, and looking at kind of this Russian imperial, to what extent this past has been worked through, and what kind of, how this can be productively used, this contextualization for kind of in this comparative framework. For Nadia, I found really interesting like the concept beyond these kind of divisions and different interpretations that are taken by different religious denomination, what you show this common use of reconciliation and forgiveness, which are used by all Christian churches, and this also in thinking how reconciliation can be defined differently. And I think here it's also, there is potential where you could delve into these definitions, even if you use the same terminology, the understanding what it means, reconciliation and forgiveness, and also as a future potential kind of common ground for thinking about next steps, and that can be, I think, interesting. And as I said, I think also you could really productively also look at kind of how you look not only at church discourse, but different religious denomination, but also look at divisions which exist in Ukrainian society. Then last paper, it sounded very theoretical for most of us working in memory studies, transitional justice, but I find that Ananda Abeysekara's ideas really can be used to make sense of all of the three papers and many issues which we are discussing during the conference. like this post-secular critique of Western modernity, which is adding to post-structuralist, postmodern, and post-colonial critique of Western modernity, and really, I think Abhay Sekara is going at the core issues which we're discussing during the conference, where he's trying to show more what kind of fluid terms and more fluid thinking we can use in thinking about this dividing line, which he thinks is a part of Western modernity between secular and religious. And as he shows, this critique of Western separation between secular and religious is introducing divisions in society and conflicts. And that's how I would connect also to Patryk's paper, where using the whole notion of Western modernity and the separation between secular and religious, what conflict it brings. And we see very clearly these conflicts, how they play just the adoption of Western kind of nation-state model, what kind of conflicts it brings with the adoption of the model itself. And I think in Ukraine, this is even more clear, and we could think about like early modern solution even of Western Europe, of adopting secularism as a kind of discourse of conflict, religious conflict, as a solution to religious conflict, where it also kind of allows us to think in such terms about Western modernity and understanding kind of this early modern period in a European context. To Tomasz, I have two questions, two reflections. Like when I was reading your paper, I was thinking about Abhay Sekara's book, where he has an entire chapter on justice, and he calls this impossibility of justice. And my consideration was, how would you engage with Abhay Sekara's thinking about justice and overall your concept of epistemological justice? What would he respond if he would listen how you, kind of him thinking about justice as a kind of impossibility of justice, and you using this as a kind of your core lens of analysis? And second, you are using Miranda Flicker's kind of definition of epistemological justice. In my understanding, she is more applying this to interpersonal justice in analyzing in interpersonal relations. So also I was thinking, how would you apply this concept to more fundamental systems of knowledge which pertain to Western modernity, which is my understanding of Abhay Sekara. But overall, thank you so much. It really was very much thought-provoking, and I enjoyed your papers very much.
Thank you, Oksana. I think we should give the three paper presenters a chance to briefly respond to Oksana's comments, and then we'll open to the floor. Patryk, yeah, go for it.
Thank you very much for this. This is very interesting and kind observations. Of course, the success of South African transformations is highly limited, and there is a lot of flaws, including economic justice and restoration of economic rights, for example, which is currently done by the South African government. And the level of political conflict and the depth of it is also pretty high when we compare it even to the current state in Central Europe. But what I believe is the most important is to compare the starting point with the position where South Africa is currently today. So when we compare a violent conflict that was causing dozens of fatal victims every day, into a situation where we are running a democratic conflict, and even if the conflict is hot and there is a lot of issues that should be dealt in the close future, but still it's very different from being on the edge of the civic war and being just a democracy during the consolidation. So I think that it's worthy to take this lens when we are comparing or using a comparison with South Africa. And also I believe that the path of comparing Central and Eastern Europe with other regions that clearly started in 1990s, it's one of the most interesting issues that we can do, and that was also the work that we done as a research team in our work. Of course, I believe that the notion of external reconciliation and its religious or Christian motivations in case of the Central Europe. For example, in terms of Polish-German, Polish-Ukrainian reconciliation, that's also the very interesting thing, but I was never researching it, so for me it's hard to contribute to this topic. And finally, I believe that it's also interesting to follow the question of colonialism versus Russian imperialism, because it's probably two different faces of the imperial idea, and it will be it's also a quite popular approach to try to use post-colonial studies methodology to investigate how Central and Eastern European societies were overcoming the heritage of Russian dominance or Soviet dominance, and how the societies from Estonia back to the south of Bulgaria and other Balkan countries, they are trying to rebuild their identity, both political and social identities, regarding their past context with Russian imperialism and Soviet dominance. Okay, I believe that I can pass the microphone.
Thank you very much. Yes, as we have seen from the discourses of different religious organizations, even the words reconciliations can be interpreted quite differently. And but I guess that the process of reconciliation has started in Ukraine, and at the level of church. For example, last year we have observed that Filaret, Archbishop Filaret, has written letters of forgiveness, asking for forgiveness to Moscow Patriarchy. Although we couldn't follow up the development of this chain, of this story, but there was an attempt. Then at the level of relations between religious denomination and society, it is vividly represented in relations which are trying to be built by Catholic Church, Greek Catholic Church, and especially just as a practical example, at Christmas time, children from eastern part of Ukraine are invited into the families of Western Ukraine. And in this way, these stereotypes and this confrontation is weakened. And it's a practical example when church is involved in building civil society, in breaking stereotypes, in educating people, because they get now a lot of different vision of Ukraine. So I guess that reconciliation is in process in Ukraine, and the dynamic will be interesting, and we will observe it in the nearest future. Thank you.
Thanks for the questions. I think the first question about impossibility of justice in Abeysekara's vision is very difficult because his concepts are built in constant, permanent discussion with thinking of Michel Foucault and mainly Jacques Derrida. With his idea of messianicity, with something which always is to come, but doesn't arise. But in fact doesn't arise. And for Abeysekara, this Derrida thinking is an example of a kind of maybe more soft, but still Judeo-Christian eschatology. And Abeysekara interprets this vision that justice is always a kind of premise which will be fulfilled in the future, or maybe even not, but it's still the question of the future. Abeysekara wants to completely erase the question of the future. He thinks that future is an invention of these linear, secular visions of time, of history. And I think this is because justice will be never fully satisfied for all actors which are engaged in concrete situation. And for example, he writes about these ghosts or specters that the secular scientific vision want to exorcise them, to exclude them, to take their agency by inscribing them into this linear narrative. Yes, and then the ghosts in this linear narrative, ghosts are only the remains of the past. But for Abe-Saqqara, there are different layers of time, of history. The past is still present in contemporaneity. So we cannot do a fully satisfying solution of the problem of the conflict between various actors. One of empirical ethnographical examples which he uses is the conflict between Tamil and Sinhalese people at the Sri Lanka. And in his perspective, the Sri Lanka state, ruled by Sinhalese people, draws on the patterns of Western political culture. And in this context, these ghosts or specters are on the side of Tamil people. Yes, and there is also, this is religious conflict, ethnic conflict, and so on. There are very different dimensions. The social conflict too, and in his perspective, there is completely no satisfying solutions. So I think that the question about impossibility of justice in Abe-Saqqara's vision is impossible to answer. And the second question about Fricker and her vision. Fricker and also Fuller, which I quoted, they are analytical philosophers. So there is very little of empirical data, and they operate on abstract examples. For example, Fricker mentioned example of black people who aren't trusted by authorities, yes, and I think in her vision, and also Fuller, the question of epistemic justice operates both in interpersonal level of relationships and also the institutional. Because this is always very mixed. I think that these notions of hermeneutical and testimonial injustice, they are very clear and abstract, and if we want to use them practically, we must recognize them only as some moments of the empirical continuum of empirical situation. Thank you very much.
Okay, we have roughly 25 minutes for questions, so good job, everyone. Is there a microphone going around? Okay. Let's collect a few, okay? Go for it. Yeah, go yeah.
Thank you very much for interesting panel. I wanted to ask Patryk, I don't know if it's a comment, whether you would comment or respond, but I wonder if it's this burden that has been put by transitional justice, more critical leftist transitional justice literature on South African transition is really fair, in the sense that it's one thing to reconcile and prevent conflict, and another thing to actually achieve social transformation. And a lot of this literature is about why South Africans did not achieve social transformation, although they prevented conflict. And this is coming from the perspective of former Yugoslavia, where the transition failed and you had more than 150,000 people dead. And 5 years of war, and then 20 years wasted because of the war. And an overall comment also, that includes Poland, whether we take for granted the achievements in transitions, in the case of South Africa or Poland entering EU and NATO, and we don't realize that other societies have not managed that well in transition, and it could have gone very badly both in Poland or in South Africa. Just a note, because I think it's important. Last week I was in Macedonia in a panel with the government there. So the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Dimitrov mentioning specifically the example of countries like Poland, which have actually joined the EU and NATO, and they think this is now given. They said, we've been left outside for too long, and people who have been in very early don't tend to forget how cold it can be outside institutions, outside peace, in fact, in some cases. So just, I don't think you were critical of South Africa, but you mentioned criticism. Thanks.
Okay. My question is about the difference between the anti-colonial and post-colonial. And in many cases, East European discourses on the memory about the Russian imperialism looks like very much anti-colonial. Anti-colonial means, in a sense, it has a connotation that a certain regret, we could be an empire instead of the colonized, right? Post-colonial always implies a certain self-criticism against that sort of anti-colonial desire. So one has a stance of the post-colonial stance actually may lead us to a sort of self-criticism. For example, yesterday's Małgorzatas, a case studies in some local, Lubelszczyzna, for example, in Poland, right? There is a certain stress on the pacification history, and the Poles were always depicted as victims by the pacification policy. But on the other hand, it just obscures Polish colonial past against other minorities in those areas. So I think the post-colonial stance could be differentiated from the anti-colonial stance. Actually, in 1960s, all the memory discourses in East Asia or in the non-European colonies against the European colonialism actually was imbued with the anti-colonial rather than post-colonial. So we need to really think of what the post-colonial would mean to the landscape in Eastern Europe today. That's my.
Thank you. Thank you for all the panelists. I'm Alla Marchenko, Institute of Philosophy and Sociology, Polish Academy of Sciences. I have several questions, and my first question is to Nadia Sanskar. It was a very interesting research, and my question is more about methodology. How did you elaborate on a discourse of this or that community? So what sources did you include? And the second question is connected to the first one. Did you notice any kind of polyphony in this discourse within the community? Or are there any communities that were more polyphonic than the others, and what it means? And a small question, or maybe a curiosity to Patryk Wawrzyński. So when we speak about the success of this Rainbow Nation ideas concept, can you elaborate more maybe on the reception of these ideas in South Africa now, and was there also any significant change, like disillusionment or kind of more critical reception from below, from regular people? Thank you.
Okay, Grace, then Ekaterina, and then we answer. Okay.
I'm Grace Davey from University of Exeter in the UK. It's a very quick question, and I wonder if it spreads beyond this panel, but I just would like to include it in the discussion. Is what is the role of diasporas in the sustaining of memories in terms of religion? I mean, for example, I'm thinking of Ukrainian diasporas and whether they reacted in any way to the differences of opinion, and did they play a part in this? And in the African situation, of course, I'm thinking of, in a way, it is an extension of European churches. I want to say how much I admired the theoretical paper, but it's very hard to formulate questions quickly on something as dense as that, but I would love to read it. Thank you.
First of all, I want to thank all the panelists for this very rich and inspiring discussion, and I have a horrible question. I apologize in advance, and it goes to Nadia. Could you please comment on the very possibility of reconciliation in Ukraine, given the developments of the last few weeks? You know what I mean, right? Thank you.
Okay, who wants to go first? Same order as before? Patryk?
Okay. Thank you very much. I've collected a number of questions. I will really try to do as essential as it's possible. Of course, there is a lot of leftist but also right-wing criticism of South African transformations. Mostly they are focused on economic lack of the economic empowerment, the issues of land reform, and the economic rights of the people. So that's of course the part of the criticism. And what I believe is critical in considering transformations and and transitional narratives is to discuss from our perspective the alternatives, what you've mentioned, because the paths of transformation both in South Africa and Poland that could be really differently, and the result might be really different. So considering the starting point and the ending point, it's in my opinion critical. So that's also one of the reasons when discussing with my colleagues from South Africa, I'm emphasizing them, don't be that critical to your transformations. You did a lot of stuff, and there is a long list of successes. And of course, when we are involved and we are living in one country, we want to have this country the best as possible. But it's in politics, it's not that easy. So I believe that the comparing worst case scenarios is really influential and should be influential in critical analysis also for the leftist perspective. And in Africa we have a number of worst case scenarios to compare, because if we find the post-colonial policy in Zimbabwe, that's the worst case scenario, and also the other countries in neighboring countries like Mozambique or Angola, they also show that even despite the goodwill and hopes, there is a great number of things that may go wrong and cause troubles and extending political conflict. So I will hope to briefly, maybe not answer, but to contribute to this question about anti-colonialism and post-colonialism. And what I believe is interesting when comparing Poland and South Africa is that there is also a third notion in this aspect. So it's not only the question of relations between being anti-colonial or anti-imperial and post-colonial, so being after being a new freedom, a new free country and country that emancipated itself. But there is also a question of the country that was a colonial power or hopes to be a colonial power or hoped to be a regional leader. So in the case of South Africa, we have at the same time narratives of being colonialized, but also a narrative of being a colonial power, because we should remember that South African government was a colonial power in southwestern Africa, so today is Namibia. And that was also one of the things that should be overcome. And there was a necessity to produce some narratives answering why our country, despite if it was ruled by African nationalists, but it was our country, was also a reason of suffering for our neighboring nation. And that also was production. And the same case is present in Polish narratives, which the Polish narratives of Polish national mythology is full of being the local leader and the most important power. And even today, it's still a present notion in political debates that to be a regional power and being the first of Central European nations. So that's also the kind of a triangle between being colonialized, wishing to be at least the most important power, and also being anti-imperial in its history. So I'm not sure that I can answer this question, but I believe that I can at least slightly contribute to this debate. And coming to the following question about the rainbowism today in South Africa, of course, as in every country, the post-transitional country, it's highly criticized from every part of the political stage. Of course, it's mentioned that it was lacking of the great vision, but what I believe is that it's easy to judge the concept from the 25 or 30 years of the perspective, when we have a number of details and data that can be used to analyze and to criticize. But considering the rainbow nation, or the whole idea of melting pots and so on, kinds of new inclusive identities, is that maybe it's not a successful 30 or 25 years later. Maybe now for South Africa or for other countries, it's time to develop its new own political identity or new collective identities. But it is important to ask a question whether it was successful those days. And I believe that in South Africa, in mid-1990s, it played its role. So from this perspective, and being a political scientist, I think that as a political process, the Rainbow Nation, even if it is highly criticized today from very different perspectives, was a success for South Africa, and that was one of the best choices done by Nelson Mandela's government. And finally, unfortunately, I don't find myself able to answer the question about diasporas and European churches' role. Unfortunately, I don't have knowledge to.
What I'm really thinking is the influence of South Africa back on the colonial past.
Okay, so I think that there are two streams of the influence. Firstly, was that the European Western churches were highly involved during the anti-apartheid struggle, and there was a critical power that was pressuring European governments and the American government to stand against the South African nationalist government. Because during the Cold War, the pressure from the West started. So despite being a close ally in the war against the Soviet, in the struggle against the Soviet Union, that was also a war in Africa, in Angola and Mozambique, where for example, the United States were allied with South African government. From 1984, and mostly during Ronald Reagan's presidency, there was a strong pressure that was lobbied by mostly Christian communities and churches, which highly supported the struggle for inclusive society, democracy, and civic rights. But also there was a second stream, and it was a stream of white people who were migrating mostly to North America and the United Kingdom, that were coming to Europe and North America and claiming that the new government of South Africa is against human rights, in fact. So that was also creating a new communities, and there are some pretty strong and highly supported from Europe and North America communities in the US, that in South Africa, that they are claiming that the new government or new political system is in South Africa is still a racial-based, and it's still a racialism in there, but it's the opposite way. So while before 1904 non-whites were repressed, then today mostly whites are repressed, and it came back as a question after the land reform suggested by the current South African President, Mr. Cyril Ramaphosa.
Okay, thank you for the questions. So first of all, I would like to mention those methodology. Alla, thank you for the question. So my corpus consisted of about 2,000 texts, and I mostly focused on religious leaders, interviews, texts, their presentation, their sermons, their interviews. And of course, I took officially recognized those religious organizations that are represented in Ukraine. I didn't deal with occupied territory, and this question will be echoed with the next question you gave, that if there are any polyphony within one community. And yes, I can say that there is, because if we take the communities that left the occupied territories, for example, Umma, yeah, and leader Said Ismailo, so they have very patriotic position, and so it is reflected in their text. But I have no idea how it is represented in the occupied regions, and I guess that they are more tolerant to Russian, and they will have a completely different vision of it. As well, the same with Jewish community. Then, as for diaspora, it's a great question, but unfortunately, I'm not very good at it. So I only know that they really help at different levels to the actors, I mean, to Ukrainian army, to veterans of conflict, and so on. So, I'm sorry, I don't know. So, Tomasz and reconciliation. I think it's too early to speak about it. And the first task for Orthodox Church, I mean Kiev Patriarchate, is to build a bridge within the society, because there is a huge gap, cultural gap, and I mean even mental gap between society, Ukrainian modern society, and the church as an institution. And it would be a very great challenge for them to not to lag behind the development of society, but to meet society's expectations, and not only Ukrainian society expectations, but the expectations from the ecumenical council. So I think that it's on the way, on the first place to think over. So, thank you.
There was a question to me.
Okay, we have time for one more brief round of questions, comments, criticisms, character assassinations, as long as it's brief. Nothing?
If we have no general questions, we can, of course, continue our discussions during the lunch. So we would like to invite you, and the lunch is, as always, you go straight and you will find it. Thank you, and, and see you after lunch.